Lessons in Logic, video number 52. And for the lower right-hand corner of the screen, I've selected what I believe to be a public domain image of some lovely rocks from Matobo National Park in Zimbabwe. So now let's talk about arguments from ignorance. No new fallacy here. We talked about this, I think, 2 videos back, but I wanted to go into a little more detail on arguments from ignorance because I happen to have a Ricochet post I recently wrote on the subject. Well, recently-ish, earlier this year. I'm recording this in 2022. So an argument from ignorance happens when we argue that something is not the case because we don't have evidence for it, or argue that something is the case because we don't have evidence against it. Arguments from ignorance are fallacious often enough that the term argument from ignorance, or Latin argumentum ad ignorantiam, is often given as the name of an informal fallacy. Now, that's not very precise. Argument from ignorance is the name of a pattern of argument, a way of reasoning about things, but there are very few patterns of argument that are inherently fallacious. It depends on what the argument is supposed to accomplish and on what we're reasoning about, not always and only on the way we reason about it. Most of what we call the informal fallacies are just argument patterns that have the misfortune to be used fallaciously fairly often. And there's some ignorance out there about arguments from ignorance, so I wanted to clear it up in this Ricochet post now in this video. Let's start with this. Arguments from ignorance are not all fallacious. And after that, we'll talk about how some arguments that are labeled arguments from ignorance are nothing of the sort. And also some arguments that rely on ignorance are not arguments from ignorance. But there's still questions we can ask about those arguments. So first thing to clarify, which if you've been watching these videos, you don't need me to clarify for you, but arguments from ignorance are not all fallacious. They're not necessarily bad. Here's an argument for ignorance. I have no evidence that there are any elephants in my living room or in my office. Substitute the room you like. Therefore, there are probably no elephants there. Now, the same pattern of argument can be used fallaciously, as when I reason, I see no evidence of spiders in my office or my living room, therefore there is no spiders there. Yeah, there could easily be a spider and you haven't seen the evidence for it. So this argument reasons in the same way, but it's bad because it's reasoning about something different, something that yields a different answer to an important question we have to ask about arguments from ignorance. If the thing were there, would we probably have good evidence for it by now? That's the key question. That's the principle you can use, or a correct answer to that question will be the principle you can use to evaluate an argument from ignorance. Arguments from ignorance, even if they aren't fallacious, do tend to have this disadvantage. If we learn just the right thing in the future, the argument may turn out to have been wrong. That doesn't make an argument from ignorance fallacious, but it does mean that it is fallible. Fallacious and fallible are not the same thing. Fallible means it could be mistaken. Fallacious means it's making an error in reasoning. Once in a while, you might actually find an elephant in the living room, as in the classic Far Side cartoon from Gary Larson, or well, never mind my thought experiments about how could there be a small elephant in a jar in the room or something. Elephant that went through a shrinking machine. There are ways you can imagine there's an elephant in this room, and I haven't seen it, even if there's clearly a room for a full-grown elephant in this room. It's conceivable. There's an elephant in this room, and I don't know about it. It's very small. Okay. So arguments from ignorance are not inherently fallacious. Now let's talk about arguments from ignorance and what are some arguments from ignorance of interest. Here's one. If God existed, he would have made his existence obvious. He hasn't, so he probably doesn't exist. Here's one. If there were a WMD in Iraq, we would have found them by now. We haven't, so there probably weren't any. Or if aliens existed, I would probably have seen some better evidence for it by now. I haven't, so they probably don't exist. Not all arguments from ignorance are both fallacious and useless. Some might be pretty good. Some are interesting. Now, we can quibble with these particular arguments. Some people will argue that God would not necessarily make it obvious. That's a big topic in philosophy of religion, actually. And would the aliens make it obvious? And not every argument from ignorance necessarily has true premises. Many of us do believe there is some pretty decent evidence for the existence of God. Oh, and WMD in Iraq, well, there certainly were up to 5,000 of them, as New York Times reported. Although whether those justified all claims made about WMD before the 2000, am I getting the year wrong? My brain's telling me 2003. I think 2004 is the one. Before the 2004 American, what word to use, invasion, well, there were 40-something other countries involved at some level. Before the American military action in Iraq in 2004, if I'm not just kidding, all the details scrambled. Before the military action in 2004, certain things are said about WMD, and 5,000 WMD reported by the New York Times here later found are 5,000 older sarin mustard weapons from quite some time before, and dangerous enough that they harmed American soldiers who were dealing with them. But I'm not sure if there's clarity as to how effective they would have been if used as WMD, if they'd actually been deployed by Saddam Hussein. So I'm not saying everything's very simple and everything George W. Bush said was correct. I'm saying, as an aside, that there are sometimes grounds to question the premises of some arguments from ignorance. Those of us who think there's good evidence for the existence of God, and yeah, there were some WMD in Iraq, although maybe they weren't exactly the kind of weapons that were predicted. But that's not even the point here. The point is, these arguments are pretty interesting, and I don't think they're particularly bad. Maybe there's some flaw in them, and maybe a premise is false, but these arguments are certainly interesting. They might be pretty good arguments from ignorance, or at any rate, we shouldn't dismiss them without carefully considering them. Now, let's talk about the other really interesting arguments from ignorance. You know, the ones everyone knows about, that God exists because we have no idea how to explain things otherwise, or human beings must have non-physical souls because otherwise we can't explain consciousness or something. People talk about arguments from ignorance for the existence of God a lot, and not as often, but they do sometimes talk about arguments from ignorance for the existence of a non-physical soul. Now, even though I just alluded to them and said everyone knows, actually no one knows what's not true, and I don't think these arguments even exist. I've never even seen one. Well, let me be a little more precise here. Let me say that I've looked over a lot of arguments for the existence of God: cosmological, teleological, moral, ontological, cosmological, teleological, moral, ontological, cosmontological, Platonic, empirical, and probably a few others. I don't know of any argument from ignorance for the existence of God. I've never seen one in Augustine, Anselm Aquinas, Descartes, William James, Lamech, Iqbal, C.S. Lewis, Richard Swinburne, Alan Plantinga, Robert Adams, William Lane Craig, Andrew Logue, and some other characters. These are arguments. The arguments these guys make are arguments from things we know. They're not arguments from ignorance. William Paley's argument, if you're familiar with that, was not an argument from ignorance. It was an argument from analogy. So I don't know where these arguments for the existence of God from ignorance actually are. I think they may be entirely a myth. If they're not a myth, they must be greatly exaggerated, because I've been studying this stuff for a while and I've never seen such an argument. All the arguments I have seen are not arguments from ignorance. They're arguments from things we know. Though there is something important to clarify. We'll get to that in a moment. Here's an interesting argument. If matter could produce consciousness, we'd probably have figured out how by now. We have no idea how matter could produce consciousness, so the mind is probably not the same thing as the body. Now, that's an interesting argument. It might actually be a pretty good argument if vulnerable to the possibility that tomorrow some scientists will make the crucial discovery that bridges matter and mind. What really interests me, though, is that I don't know whoever even made this argument. People who talk about the non-physical soul and argue that it exists are not, as far as I've ever encountered them, making arguments from ignorance. They're making arguments from knowledge. Descartes is a paradigm example here, and no time to go into the detail. Descartes, this early modern philosopher who argues the soul is not the same thing as the body, etc., etc. Matter cannot produce consciousness. He makes arguments from knowledge, arguments from what he knows about mind and what he knows about matter, to the conclusion that they're not the same thing. I don't think I've ever encountered an argument from ignorance for the immaterial soul. Now, the thing is, the God of the gaps argument, which is shorthand for argument from ignorance, the God of the gaps argument, or the soul of the gaps argument, is what people think people make. These are the kinds of arguments that people think people make. People even think it's common knowledge, but I don't know why people think this, because I've never seen the arguments, except this one that I typed up here, and I don't know whoever even made that argument. I'm not sure I like it myself, though it is interesting, and maybe it's a decent argument. So Brandon Rickabow has a good article on how arguments for non-physical souls are not soul of the gaps arguments, and if you go to this URL, you should be able to find it. The URL I'm looking at is this one. Google Ricochet space quotation mark arguments from ignorance close quotation mark, and you should be able to find this thing I'm looking at here. And then find, if you want to, this article on soul of the gaps being largely, if not entirely, a myth. So let me state that I hesitate to argue for my arguments I hesitate to argue for my ignorance of anyone making these kinds of arguments from ignorance that no one ever has. The main point is simpler. If these arguments exist at all, their prominence must be greatly exaggerated. I've never seen a God of the gaps argument. So there's other arguments of some interest. What about this one? This is Stephen Meyer intelligent design argument. Here's a blog post I linked to that presents an argument from Stephen Meyer in his intelligent design case. I suppose I better pull up a photo of Stephen Meyer. Stephen Meyer looks like that. As represented on the blog post, his argument is, despite a thorough search, no material causes have been discovered that demonstrate the power to produce large amounts of specified information, like the information in our DNA. Intelligent causes have demonstrated this power. Therefore, intelligent design of our DNA is the best, most causally adequate explanation for the information in the cell, the information in our DNA. Now, this is an interesting argument, and it does actually rely on ignorance. What I want to explain here is it's not an argument from ignorance just because it relies on ignorance. It's not from ignorance, but it relies on ignorance in one particular sense, which we must explain. Look at this argument. There is no known explanation for the mess in the living room other than that the kids did it. This is a daily situation for me, or this type of situation is a daily type of situation for me. So there's no known explanation for the mess in the living room other than that the kids did it. This is the sort of thing the kids normally do. Therefore, the kids probably made the mess in the living room. That's a good argument. Or this one. This is not true now, but this certainly happened in the past. We don't know of any reason to think Mark's symptoms are caused by something other than a sinus infection. Mark's symptoms correspond to a sinus infection, so Mark probably has a sinus infection. This has happened to me a number of times. And this illustrates an important point about ignorance and science. Every argument that draws some conclusion about efficient causes for some physical phenomenon relies on our ignorance of any other cause. Let me repeat that. Every argument that draws some conclusion about what caused some physical phenomenon relies on our ignorance of any other equally likely cause or equally good explanation. In this way, scientific reasoning relies on ignorance, but that doesn't mean scientific reasoning is arguing from ignorance. It's not. In this example, the sinus infection example, this one, pause video and read if you need to, read again. In this example, the argument argues from knowledge of Mark's symptoms, knowledge of sinus infections, and an understanding of the fact that they fit. The explanation fits the thing to be explained. Our knowledge of sinus infections fits our knowledge of Mark's symptoms. There's no ignorance involved in making the argument. The ignorance is there, but it's not doing any of the real work. The ignorance is just making sure we don't have any competing explanation that's as good as this one. Now, that leaves us with at least one interesting question about intelligent design arguments. Are they scientific arguments? Meyer's argument here. Scrolling up. Despite a thorough search, we have no material cause that can create specified information in large amounts. Intelligent causes do this. We know that. Therefore, intelligent design is the best, most causally adequate explanation for the information in our DNA. Now, is that a scientific argument? It's not an argument from ignorance. I'm quite happy if we stop there. But going on further, I like to always be going on. Don't quit searching for wisdom. These arguments, are they scientific arguments? You could argue that they're not falsifiable. They're therefore unscientific. Now, I like that objection. It draws from Karl Popper's philosophy of science, and Popper is awesome. And it is indeed hard to see how one could falsify that. Now, actually, one could easily falsify one aspect of this. One could find an alternative explanation. One could just prove this premise wrong. No material causes has been discovered that demonstrate the power to produce large amounts of specified information. Find the material cause, and you're done. You've proven this premise to be wrong. But the conclusion that we are created by an intelligent designer of significant knowledge, wisdom, power, this conclusion, how do you falsify that directly? I don't know that you could. So if falsification, rather falsifiability, is the essential characteristic of science, that's a very interesting objection to intelligent design arguments being scientific. Now, the worst I can say about this objection is that while I like Karl Popper, I also like Thomas Kuhn. His philosophy of science, I think, is very respectable. It might even be correct. But also, frankly, I don't even care. I'm pointing out this is a viable question, I think. If you have the Popper philosophy of science and you look specifically at the conclusion, I at least am not aware of how you would falsify that conclusion. What sort of data would be data that could disprove that conclusion as such? Although you can easily falsify a premise in that argument, I don't know how to falsify the conclusion directly, which might mean the conclusion is not itself a scientific hypothesis on Karl Popper's philosophy of science. And the worst I can say about that again is I'm not convinced that's the only correct philosophy of science. It's an awesome philosophy of science. I have my doubts as to whether it's correct. I also like Thomas Kuhn. I got my doubts about Kuhn too, but I don't know. Maybe he's right. At any rate, I like them both. They're both wonderful philosophers of science. But the real point is just that this is a question. Assuming Karl Popper's science is not completely ruled out, this is a viable question, I think, about an argument like that intelligent design argument. Can it actually have a scientific conclusion as such? But the really important point is that it's not an argument from ignorance. And really, I don't care if it's scientific as such. I care about the logic. Do the premises do a good job supporting the conclusion, whether or not they're scientific or philosophical or theological or something else? I don't particularly care all that much. Speaking of only caring about the logic, that's probably all I have to say. I'm trying to clarify some things about arguments from ignorance. They're not all fallacious. Some are interesting and good, or at least debatable. Some things that are labeled arguments from ignorance, like anything supposedly a God of the gaps argument, is probably nothing of the sort. At any rate, I don't think I've seen it. Not every argument that relies on ignorance is an argument from ignorance. Keep that in mind. But that doesn't mean these are all good arguments. You still have to investigate them, and you can still ask questions of some of them. What kind of argument are they? Philosophy, science, something else? That is all. Let's be done for this week. And we'll do something else in inductive logic next week.